Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Chris, Modern Vintage Collector, and I'm here with my dad, Wayne Brandon. And we're going to talk about some sports card stuff today. We're going to talk about, and more specifically from a sociological aspect, late 1960s Detroit and kind of the prelude to the 67 race riots and then the impact that the 68 World Series had on the city. So, Dad, welcome. And
thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. Definitely want to do more of these. This isn't going to be the last one we do, but why don't you just go ahead and give a little introduction about yourself, your background.
Okay. Well, I'm a native Detroiter, born and raised in Detroit in the suburbs. Became a Tiger fan in 1957 when I attended my first game. Tigers were playing Cleveland. We lost that game. I think it was 6-3. At any rate, I was discouraged when I got home, but I was still a Tiger fan from that day on. And I didn't go to another Tiger game for a good number of years after that. Once I was, able to be mobile and move myself around without having to borrow a ride to Tiger Stadium, then I started going to the games again. Chris, baseball is probably the greatest sport ever contrived. It really is. You look at the simplicity of the game from a macro perspective, but the game has a lot of moving parts to it, and the way the mechanics of the game are administrated and performed in the field are really quite amazing. And the intellect that goes into approaching every batter, and all of that just makes it. To me, it's still America's favorite pastime. I don't care about football and basketball; those guys don't even play enough games to be a real sport. But 162 games will wear a real athlete out. And anyway, you had asked me about baseball cards. Of course, every kid from the time baseball cards started to hit the markets collected baseball cards. And by the time I started collecting my baseball cards, it was the late 1950s. We had two big producers at that time that I recall. Bowman was one and Topps was the other. And then eventually in the early 60s, I think Fleer came about. At any rate, they were all good producers of cards. Some guys like to get involved in collecting the obscure cards, those that were kind of hard to get. But we didn't have the technology available to us in those days like you have today to find out, where those cards are and what they're worth and what truly are the conditions and the standard for the conditions and that kind of thing. That didn't exist in those days with kids on the block. We'd collect typically the cards of the players that we liked. Everybody else kind of went into a separate box or off into the corner of the box that you had your favorites in, which were always, arranged in a particular order, and they were rubber banded together to keep them from getting damaged and so forth. Although the rubber bands did some damage, but that's how it was. The rest of the cards that nobody cared about, you either traded off or stuck them in your bicycle spokes and made noise. So that's kind of how it was. There were guys that kept track of stats. You had the year prior stats, and then you had lifelong stats for each player on the back of that card. And they came in a packet of 5, and for a nickel or a dime, I don't remember what it was. I think it was a nickel. You got 5 cards and some very stale chewing gum. And anyway. The card collecting didn't get real serious until we grew up, and then we realized what we had. I think out of all the cards I ever had, I only kept 2 The rest of them were either given away or lost in moves, whatever. Mom threw them away. I don't remember. But at any rate, it was Babe Ruth's farewell speech and then Lou Gehrig's farewell speech. And those came out not when the guys left the sport, but many years later, probably the early 60s, early to mid 60s. And I felt that they were collector cards because they were called part of the collector series or something. And those were kind of special. So I kept those. And of course, you always wanted the cards for the guys that you revered. And in Detroit, obviously, it was going to be guys like Al Kaline and, of course, Rocky Colavito. Everybody loved Rocky. And then you had George Kell, Jim Bunning, Charlie Pawpaw Maxwell. Those were some of the names that were pretty common back in the late 50s, early 60s. And then, of course, by the time the mid to late 60s came about, 1966, I think, between 64 and 66 was a formulation year or a couple of years for the Tigers. I mean, they were picking up guys like Jim Northrup and Gates Brown and Willie Horton and Mickey Lolich. McLean came along a little bit later. But they were really building a team that had some heft to it. They were going to be contenders. Bill Freehand came along a little bit later than that, but it was a culmination of a collection of guys that really melded well together to form that 67 and 68 team. The 67 team was good, really was a good team, but it just missed some of the chemistry that you need to get over the line. 68, that was the year, of course. You had Bob Sheffing, who had been a manager, and I think it was Sheffing that had the heart attack, and he was replaced. I can't remember the fellow who replaced him.
Wasn't Dressen, was it?
Charlie Dressen, yes, thank you. And then Mayo Smith came along. I wasn't real fond of Mayo Smith at first. I mean, the guy was kind of an oddity to me. I didn't understand how he managed that team. He'd do things that were peculiar. And one of the things that he did that just it was felt to be extraordinary by almost everybody who knows anything about baseball was in the World Series moving Mickey Stanley, the Golden Glove center fielder, to shortstop. I mean, who does that? Mayo Smith does that. Mayo Smith knew how to win games. And we'll talk more about the 68 team in a little bit. Well, the team in 67, as I mentioned, was very talented. Had to be, because they evolved the very next year into one of the best teams ever to take the field. Even though they were considered underdogs, in contrast to the Cardinals, who seemed to be in the World Series almost every year, kind of like the Yankees, who everybody hated, unless you were a Yankee fan. But anyhow, the 67 team was just coming into its own, and I think that even if they had gone into the World Series, I'm not sure they would have won it that year. They needed a guy like Denny McLean and a guy like Lolich to be at their prime in order to get through that year, which created that momentum of not only chemistry but confidence that comes from the chemistry, and where you go out and you're going to win. And that was the attitude in 68. But 67, you didn't feel that. let's talk just a little bit about the dynamics of what was taking place in Detroit at that time. Um, 66 and 67 weren't the best years economy-wise for the Motor City, but they were okay, and people were doing okay. Um, the city is an odd place. It has a life all of its own. I don't care what city it is. And you have an amalgam of citizens who are running from one end of the social economic spectrum to the other. And you don't really pay much attention to what's going on in the cities. We were living in Bloomfield Hills at the time. And, if I went to Detroit, it was to go to a ball game, or it was to go to the Detroit Institute of Arts, or to go to J.L. Hudson's. Detroit was a great city for many decades. The 60s changed all of that. People started moving to the suburbs in droves, and it was a talent drain like you can't imagine. The value of the homes in the Oakland County area in particular was outside of the reach of most ordinary people. And those that wanted to leave the city did. The city was starting to become run down, and it wasn't the shining diamond it had been at one time. And you really didn't pay attention to what was going on down there. You didn't know the dynamics of what was happening in the law enforcement community, or race relations, or anything like that. But that summer, if I remember it correctly, I think I do, was, even though it had fairly ordinary temperatures, the humidity was such that it was almost suffocating sometimes. I mean, and you couldn't get to sleep. If you had air conditioning, you were doing better than most folks. Not everybody had it in those days. In fact, most people didn't have it. You just opened your windows, turned on some fans. And when you're living in the city, all that heat is contained within those buildings and on the streets. All that concrete just holds it right there.
Blacktop in those days?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Detroit was a very modern city. And it wears on you. You become fatigued, and you don't think clearly when you're fatigued. And little things start to aggravate you. There were racial tensions throughout the country at that time, and for a wide variety of reasons. We don't need to get into all of that, but we're talking baseball here, and baseball and the Riot in Detroit. And it was a riot. It wasn't an incident. It was a riot. All began simply because there was something called blind pig at that time. They still kind of call them that, but you don't hear that much anymore. The phrase was coined back in the 20s during the Prohibition era. And particular location would close the doors at a certain time and open up the building for a select group of people to come in and gamble and to drink, and it was all illegal. Couldn't do it. And they knew it. In this particular case, the Detroit Police Department had identified this place as being one of those blind pigs. And they planned a raid for it, and I spent a number of years in law enforcement. You don't decide one night you're going to go raid something. I mean, you plan these things. So this was probably a week in the making, at least 3 days. So it wasn't like the police just decided to kick down doors and roust people. They did raid this blind pig. They arrested 82 people that were there. And what was also happening in conjunction with the illegal activities was a party for at least one guy that came home from Vietnam, and there are reports that there were two guys. So okay, whether it's one or two doesn't really matter. But the owner of that establishment had a son, and he lived next door. I think his name was William Scott, maybe the second or third, I don't know. At any rate, he came out, he saw what was happening. There was a crowd that gathered outside because of all of the commotion and the flashing lights and that kind of thing. And this William Scott decided that he was going to get the crowd worked up. I mean, these people were all in an agitated state anyway. They were a bomb looking for a fuse, and he gave it to them. And he gave it to them by throwing a bottle at a police officer. I can think of fewer more stupid things to do in your life than that, especially in the city of Detroit. Those guys did not fool around in those days. And they tried to do things the right way, but at that point, all chaos broke out, and there was no more containment. People broke away from that crowd, went across the street to a I think it was a clothing store. It was a department store of some sort, and they broke the glass out and began looting the store. And it took time for this thing to work its way through the city. I mean, the whole thing lasted 4 days, but it wasn't until the next afternoon that fires started to show up throughout the neighborhood. And it wasn't until Sunday that the mayor and the chief of police were able to get enough people together to try to calm this thing down. But they found out very soon that the state police and the sheriff's department and Detroit PD were not sufficient. They weren't able to contain it. So, long story short, President Johnson called in the elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne. And both of those units had tank brigades attached to them, and one of those tank brigades came with the unit. The National Guard was also called up, and it took them about 48 hours to get control of the city again. In the meantime, here's how baseball figures into it. And it's kind of quirky the way life, the paths of life will tend to cross somewhere in a way that you never imagined they would. Tigers were playing a doubleheader that particular day, and one of the pitchers was Mickey Lolich. And you have to remember that there was a player in Detroit at that time named Willie Horton. Willie was a homegrown boy. He was a local boy that made good. And he had grown up in Detroit and gotten a call from the Tigers and really became probably the psychological cornerstone for that team. If you had to pick one guy, who would that one guy be? And ordinarily it's some flamboyant guy, right? Like Willie Mays or an Al Kaline. Not in this case. Willie was as stable and as thoughtful a man as you're going to find. And he was pretty much a gentle giant, but you sure wouldn't want to tangle with him. He was a big boy. Anyway, he goes out after the game and he sees what's going on, and he jumps on the hood of a car, and he's in his uniform. He hadn't even changed out of his uniform yet. People recognized him, and he exposed himself to some danger out there. I mean, they were tearing things up and people were getting hurt. And he went out and he got on the hood of a car and he starts calling out to the people, saying, please stop this, calm down, you're tearing up your own city. And while they respected him, they ignored him. And they went about doing what they did. And Willie always felt bad about not being able to make more of an impact than he did. But he really tried. I mean, this guy went out and he did it. He didn't just think about it. He didn't talk about doing it. He didn't even hesitate. He just went from the locker room or the field to the streets. And somebody else went from the field to the locker room to the streets, and that was Mickey Lolich. Mickey was a private first class in the Michigan National Guard. And he was pitching baseball one minute and carrying a rifle the next. He found himself on active duty for the duration of that incident. So fortunately, he had his 1 day of pitching out of the way, and he could have 3 days rest. And by the time he got off of that assignment, he could be back on the roster and right up again. So anyway,
this was in '67.
This was in '67. You bet. The damage was phenomenal. It covered a large quantity of city blocks. Hundreds of buildings burned out, looted. The press said that 42 people were killed and 1,100 and some, I think 1,120 something, were injured. Years later, when I was working for the police department, the new chief that they had hired was a fellow by the name of Gene Reno, who had spent 27 years in vice and homicide and was there during the riots.
Was it 27 years in Detroit?
27 years in Detroit, yep. And he was not the tough as leather kind of guy that you would think he would be. He had a real sense of humor, and although it was kind of macabre and a little droll, it was certainly there, and he was somebody that everybody took a liking to very quickly. One day I asked him, what was the '67 riots like? I mean, I couldn't even get downtown. I tried to drive downtown one afternoon, and they had a curfew going. And after 6 o'clock, nobody was coming into the city. You couldn't cross 8 Mile Road. So he said, well, whatever you read in the newspapers is only about a third right. He said there was a lot more activity going on down there than what you'd imagine. And the reason for that wasn't that people didn't want to report the truth. It's that they didn't report the whole truth because they wanted to contain things. They didn't want to give it a focus and say, if we show these people rioting, other people get the idea it's okay to riot and this thing will expand. It's the right kind of thinking. It didn't work, but it was the right kind of thinking. I guess you can't say it didn't work completely because you don't know the end of something unless you play both ends of it. And in this particular case, could it have been worse? I suppose. So we'll just let it rest that they did the right thing, no matter how it turned out. But according to Gene Reno, a guy who was in homicide at that time, you can take that 42 or 43 people that they said were killed and multiply that by about 20. He said they were finding bodies all over the city, burned out buildings, in the sewers, shoved down elevator shafts, any place you could stuff a body, that's where you found them. And these were opportunity killings. These were murders taking place by people that had a grudge against somebody. It was vengeance and that kind of thing, drug related. The deal's gone bad, that kind of thing. So he said there was a lot more of that. He said, but it does no good to report that kind of thing. So they reported this one number, and that's how it was. He said, but I was there.
Is there any indication of where that number came from, or was that just directly attributed to the riots?
Well, I can't be certain about that, Chris, so I really can't comment on it with any kind of authority. I'll just say that became the official number and that's what was reported. Charlie LaDuff wrote a pretty good book about Detroit that covers that period of time, and as a reporter, he saw things that were never reported. So I think it was just called Detroit or something.
An American Autopsy.
An American Autopsy, thank you. Yep, that was the book. So at any rate, that was the condition of the city in '67, and at that point, I had no more interest in going to the city until '68.